Hi, today we're going to explore phonation. So what is phonation? It's a pretty simple concept. It's air moving up from the lungs, through the trachea or the windpipe, passing through the vocal folds, creating sound, which then comes out of our mouth. And that is phonation. I'm going to explore some of the components of the larynx. And the larynx is what helps create the sound here. So it is right about here for people with an Adam's apple. That is the tip of the thyroid cartilage, not the thyroid gland, but the thyroid cartilage. And that gives you kind of an idea of where the larynx sits. And it's about the size of a walnut. So I'm going to explore some of the components of the larynx looking at this model. I'm not going to get super in-depth. If you want to take a vocal pedagogy course, you will learn all of the intricacies of the larynx. But I want to make this series accessible to everyone. And so I don't want to make this too academic, but I am going to explore some of this. So if you find this part of this lecture boring, you can fast forward. Hi, this is Larry the Larynx. And like I said, the larynx is about the size of a walnut, so this is obviously a much larger version, but it's easier to see all the individual components. So looking right here, this is the trachea, or the windpipe. If we move up here, this is the hyoid bone, and the hyoid bone connects at the base of the tongue, way down here, and it connects through muscles and ligaments. And then this here, this is what we call the epiglottis, and that covers the vocal folds when you swallow so that food or liquid does not enter inside of your vocal folds so you don't choke. Those components aren't actually involved in creating sound, so we're going to look at the components that actually do. The larynx is comprised of three major cartilage groups. The first cartilage is the bottom cartilage here, which is called the cricoid. And people say it looks kind of like a signet ring. So it wraps around here in the front, and that is also it in the back there. So that is the cricoid cartilage. The second cartilage we're going to talk about is the thyroid. So people say it kind of looks like a shield. And then if you turn it around in the back, there's all this space here. So that is the thyroid cartilage. The other cartilage group, there's two of them that function here, and this is the pair of arytenoids. So arytenoid cartilage. So because these components we just talked about are made of cartilage, they can't really move on their own, so they need muscle attachments. And we call these muscles the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. The first one we're going to examine is the cricothyroid. So here's the cricoid, and here's the thyroid. So it connects the cricoid to the thyroid. And what that does, it allows the thyroid to rock this way, forward and back, forward and back. And what that does is, inside the vocal folds, it allows the vocal folds to stretch and get shorter, longer and shorter. And that's what controls pitch. So the longer the vocal folds, when we stretch them, we're singing higher pitches. If the vocal folds are getting shorter, we're singing lower pitches. So higher, lower, and that's what happens with the vocal folds. The next intrinsic muscle we're going to look at is the thyrohyoid. And that connects the thyroid up to the hyoid bone. The thyroid cartilage up to the hyoid bone. This allows the larynx to descend and ascend, descend and ascend. And we call this kind of the idea of the dancing larynx, so that the larynx doesn't get stuck in one position, but it's allowed to move up and down a little bit. We don't want it to like push way down, and we don't want it to disappear way up here. But it allows this kind of little frame here where it can move up and down. So when we create space in our sound, the larynx moves down. I think you could just see that. So that's what that muscle helps to do. The next intrinsic muscles we're going to look at are the cricoarytenoids. And they're not labeled very well on this model, but that's all right. So they connect the cricoid here up to the arytenoids. And what that helps do, you can see in the model here, it helps to allow the arytenoids to pivot, which open and close the vocal folds. The final group of intrinsic muscles we're going to look at are the thyroarytenoids. So if you think about connecting the thyroid to the back to the arytenoids, we have to do that laterally. So here's the thyroid, and here are the arytenoids. So it's connecting here. So these white muscles, these are the thyroarytenoids. And their function is that they actually contain the vocal folds. So the innermost layer inside here on each side are the vocal folds. And the vocal folds come together and create sound. The next concept we're going to apply to phonation is called the Bernoulli Principle or the Bernoulli effect. It sounds very complicated, but in terms of singing, it's really not that tricky. If you have a tube and the sides are even, and air or liquid is passing through that, it's going to move at a steady rate. It's not going to slow down, it's not going to speed up, it's just going to be steady. If we narrow that tube in some place, the air or liquid is going to suddenly move faster in the narrow space. That's because the air pressure has dropped, and it creates a bit of a suction, and it sucks in the air into that narrow space. In terms of singing, that really is the Bernoulli principle. Once this air has passed through this narrow space, which corresponds with the inside of the trachea moving up into the larynx, we have the air sped up, and then it hits the vocal folds, which are closed. And once enough pressure is applied to them, they snap open and then close again. And these are tiny little puffs of air that come through. And because the vocal folds have kind of an elastic quality, they just snap open and then snap back closed again. And this cycle happens over and over while we're singing. We're just not even aware of it. In fact, the vocal folds vibrate. If you're singing A440, which is our general tuning pitch, the vocal folds are vibrating 440 times a second, which is pretty amazing. For a high C soprano, that's 1,000 times a second that they're vibrating. These concepts I'm presenting in terms of vocal pedagogy and voice teaching, they don't exist in a bubble. So breathing is not its own thing, phonation's not its own thing, so they're all connected. And so one thing affects the next. So looking at the Bernoulli principle, it's all about airflow. And if our support system is not lined up, our airflow is going to be inconsistent. So if we have too little air flowing through the vocal folds, we're going to overcompensate in our throat. And same thing, if there's too much air flowing, if we're forcing the air, our vocal folds are going to respond negatively to that as well. So breath support and Bernoulli principle and phonation are completely connected. And posture, if our posture's not aligned, our support's not aligned. So one thing affects the next, and it's really important to think about that. And if you are having some vocal issues or a student is having some vocal issues, maybe not go so high up in the vocal pyramid, and maybe it's something more basic that is affecting something higher up. And by vocal pyramid, what I'm talking about is the bottom of this pyramid, if we think about a triangle, posture, breathing and support, phonation, resonance, and articulation. So if we're singing and we're starting with a vowel, we have three main ways of approaching that. And we call these onsets. How do we start the sound? And the first type of onset we're going to look at is what's called a soft onset. And if these are the vocal folds, it's where the vocal folds don't quite come together. And if we were singing an ah vowel, it would sound like ah, ah, ah. And you can hear that there's a lot of air escaping in my tone, and that's because the air is moving through the vocal folds rather than vibrating on the vocal folds. So the next type of onset we're going to look at is what's called a hard onset. And that's where the vocal folds are pressed together on phonation. So So if we go, ah, ah, ah. And so they're pressed, they're not just comfortably together, but they're actually pressed. And what that does, it creates what we call a glottal stop or a glottal attack or a hard onset. What we're looking for, ideally, is a balanced onset. And that's where the vocal folds come together comfortably on phonation, but we're not pressing them together. So if we have ah, ah, ah. All right, let's do an onset exercise. So we're going to do soft, hard, and balanced.
Okay.
So I'd like you to use your hands too. So we're going to do an E, soft onset, and then a hard onset, and then a balanced onset.
Okay.
And we're going to do that on one note. So 1, 2, E. When we have a soft onset, so if it's either us or our student, there are many different reasons that can be. One is that if you have a younger singer, maybe their vocal folds just haven't fully developed yet. And that sometimes can take a little while. Another reason is if someone is particularly shy and afraid to make a louder noise, that a soft onset often corresponds with a shyer personality. So getting that student to open up and try things, getting their body involved, you making loud noises with them, getting that idea. And also resonance, when we get to that, is a huge factor in opening up the voice and getting that breathiness away. Being primarily an undergraduate voice teacher, I think another reason for soft onset, and I see this with high schoolers coming in all the time, is that they've been singing in choir and they're trying to sing blendy. They're trying to blend with everyone else, and that does not necessarily correspond with what their solo voice should sound like. So creating that idea that their solo voice and their choir voice are not necessarily going to be approached in the same way, but that also their choir singing should not necessarily have air in the tone as well. And so creating a blendy sound in choir situations, but still having a clear tone is the goal. Also in belting, glottals or glottal stops, glottal attacks are used quite frequently because we kind of hook into the sound with the belt and bring that up, or start in a high place with the belt and hook in with a glottal. And that is very stylistic. It is just something we don't want to do all the time because it can be disruptive to our vocal folds. And then finally, a reason for using glottals is that in languages, sometimes we just have to. German vowels start with a glottal. It might be a light glottal, but if a German word starts with a vowel, we generally use a light glottal on that. And that's just the language. In English, we have to use glottals every once in a while. So if you think about the words the evening, they both have an E sound. And so if we didn't re-articulate, it would sound like the evening, the evening. It almost sounds like one word, rather than the evening, E. So making that little glottal sound, that's a little glottal. And so that's necessary sometimes. We just don't want to make it a habit. Some reasons for a hard onset is that a student might be too aggressive with their sound. They might be trying to make too much sound. They might be coming from a pop background where the glottals are used all the time. And if you're trying to transfer that into, say, classical singing, it's not always applicable. Belting, quite often we kind of hook into the sound with a glottal, and that is stylistic. It's just not something we want to do all the time because, like I said, you're kind of pressing the vocal folds together, and like the size of a pinky fingernail, you know, you don't want to be too abusive with them. Before I talk more about the hard onset, it's really important to know where the term glottal attack comes from. So the open space between the vocal folds, so if we open the vocal folds, that open space is called the glottis. When we close the vocal folds, there is no glottis. We've eliminated it. There's the glottis, no glottis. So when we are talking about a glottal attack or a glottal stop, we are abruptly closing the glottis. And so that is where that term comes from. I like to think about offsets as well, how we end the sound if we're singing on a vowel, which can be really tricky sometimes because it's all about making sure you have consistent breath support and that the sound doesn't taper off at the end. And if it does taper, we call that a soft offset. And that's where if we're singing, ah, and we just kind of trail off because we don't really have enough breath to make a choice with that. And the breath just kind of trails away. So that would be a soft offset. A hard offset can be done in a couple different ways. One is by closing the throat to end the sound. This isn't quite as common, but ah, and what I did was I just closed my throat. And you do hear that once in a while. I definitely have some students who do that, but we're working on that. Another way I think about a hard offset is by closing the mouth to end the sound. And this is much more common. So if we're going ah, ah,
lo li 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 lo li
la la
la lo la lo la.
So let's change the exercise just to ah. Nice open ah, supported, and then when you finish it ah, all you have to do is inhale.
Okay.
You're
I'm gonna
ready.
adjust so I can see myself. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
1, 2, ready, and let's do some the wrong way,
Okay.
just to remember what that feels like.
Okay.
It's important to do things to remember what the wrong way feels like,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes that can creep back. And so just, oh yeah, that's what that is.
Okay.
So let's do wrong, right, right.
Okay. I will try to do it wrong on purpose.
1, 2, ready, and good. And what's so? One of the most common faults in phonation is breathiness. So air escaping in the tone. And like I said, this is all related. It's related to breath pressure and breath support. It's related to resonance. All of these things are connected. So it's hard to just talk about one, but we're talking about phonation now. So we're going to look at a student who has a lovely tone, but you can hear inconsistencies in the air speed. And once we get the idea of support connected, you can hear the tone even out and the air speed becoming much more consistent. Good. So this time I want you to think you're making really nice sound. So I want you to think about sending twice as much air through as you're sending right now. So sometimes this is actually a pretty big room, but imagine you're in a big opera theater and you have to send your sound to the back of the hall. So let's try that. Ready and go. Some basic corrective procedures for a soft onset or a hard onset are to do the opposite. And so if you have a soft onset, and that means that your vocal folds are not wanting to come together all the way, try some glottals, try some light glottals. Don't let it become a habit. But every once in a while, try some light glottals, because glottals make your vocal folds come together. And you can, as a teacher, you can incorporate that into some of your exercises. If you're a student, you can as well. Just be very conscious if your voice is getting tired, and like I said, don't overdo it. This is just a small amount. If you are having trouble with a hard onset and you're really trying to break that habit of doing glottals, try some soft onsets. try creating a slightly breathy sound so that your vocal folds don't try to slam together. Again, just do these in moderation, but they are little corrective procedures that you can try. If you are having a soft offset and you're trailing away at the end, try crescendoing through the end of the sound. Try getting louder, increasing your breath pressure so that rather than trailing off, you have to get louder at the end. Another thing that works really well is to put a consonant at the end. So if you're singing and it ends in a vowel, which is the hardest thing, put a consonant in. So if you're singing ba, you can go ba-t, and it's easier to have a destination to end the sound. You can even try both of those where you're crescendoing through the end of the sound and putting a consonant on. And that's a really helpful fix for a soft offset. For the hard offset, we kind of already addressed that with the idea of inhaling. Another thing you can do for a hard offset is this idea of messa di voce, which is swell of the voice. And this could be covered in many different units in vocal pedagogy, but let's talk about it for phonation for a moment. So it's the idea of crescendo decrescendo, and you can see this in my soprano warm-up, and really having full control of breath pressure through the crescendo decrescendo, crescendo decrescendo. And when we end phrases, particularly on a vowel, we want to make sure we have those choices of crescendo decrescendo, and that it is a dimmer switch type of control rather than a light switch. And the dimmer has all of those middle ground points that we can cover rather than a light switch where we really don't have any choices. We're either loud or soft and breathy.
Yeah.
Okay.